Welcome back to week 2 of the ADMA Cookie Masterclass. This week, Joey Nguyen is back to take us through the bottom line, the immediate and longer term impacts of this shift, and why they matter to you. Welcome, Joey.
And welcome back to Module 2, the bottom line. And today's focus, we're going to talk about the deprecation of cookies and IDFAs and the wide-reaching impacts that they'll have on organizations. So how you can prepare and understand where you need to adapt not only your existing, but also your future operational commitments related to digital marketing. What you're going to learn today is the immediate and longer-term impacts of the shift, why they matter to you, the reasons to prepare, and why you should act now. A great illustration of why you need to prepare is by looking at the current state of web browser market share. And while there are a number of players who produce web browsers, it's really a two-horse race, with Google Chrome at the top and Safari in second. And part of the reason we've been somewhat buffered from third-party cookie deprecation till now is because there's been this over 50% market share, and this is the Australian market we're talking about, over 50% market share of the Google Chrome browser. So the current state is, in Safari and most other browsers, third-party cookies are blocked. And the workarounds that are trying to circumvent the third-party cookie deprecation that are being rolled out by ad tech and other vendors are routinely targeted and blocked by Apple. Whereas Google Chrome is the last of a dying breed. We know that they're planning to, however, deprecate cookies in 2022. So there's a window of time by which to adapt, but the time is running out. And if we look at really a comparison of protections, up on screen we can see Brave, Edge, Firefox, Safari, a number of the browser alternatives to Chrome. All of them have introduced really analogous methods of protecting users from things like third-party cookies, as well as the circumvention tactics that have been introduced. But highlighted in the middle is the Chrome column, and the protections there right now are none. And looking at the mobile app world, it's even more of a two-horse race, with Apple iOS in the lead, again in the Australian market, and Android running close behind in second. And as of up until very recently, iOS and Android were really the same, where two users had the ability to go into settings and choose to opt out, whether through limit ad tracking in the iOS settings or opt out of interest-based advertising and ads personalization in the Android setting. As of the end of last year, Apple have also introduced the concept of nutrition labels. So think of what you read on cereal or any piece of food where you want to know what's in it and if it's going to be good for you or not. And what Apple has done is to put within the App Store that apps must now talk about what type of data is being captured, what's being linked to you, and what's being used to track you. And this must be submitted alongside every time there's an App Store update. It needs to be accurate, it needs to be transparent, and needs to represent your data collection practices. So when we're talking about future state, next year when Google Chrome blocks third-party cookies, all major browsers will have third-party cookies blocked. So the gaps that were able to be swept under the rug because they only impacted a fraction of users will now be close to 100% once Google Chrome's market share is included. And from an app perspective, the recently introduced app tracking transparency requires opt-in for use of IDFA and a number of other tactics that are designated as tracking by Apple. So what does asking for opt-in actually mean for you? And should you, as a brand, request users to opt in? Well, there's a couple of considerations here, and we recommend reviewing this alongside your marketing, your technology, your data, and your legal teams. But some of the considerations are, what will you actually use it for? So, for instance, Google has stated that they're not going to support IDFA within their apps. So regardless of your opt-in rate, the IDFA is only useful if there's an IDFA on the other side. If you're an advertiser, the publisher needs to have the same user opted in for you to be able to target them. So because of that two-way opt-in, if you're looking to use the IDFA in Google's ecosystem, you won't be able to. What does this mean if you don't ask for opt-in? Well, Apple's released a framework called SCAD Network that allows you to gather data on users anonymously and in an aggregate fashion that will essentially give you some visibility of reporting. It won't replace everything that you have today, but you'll still be able to get the high-level metrics. And all you have to do to integrate with SCAD Network is to make sure that the vendors you're using, the likes of Google and Facebook, etc., that you update to the latest versions of those SDKs within your app. But overall, we recommend that you, when you're making the decision on whether to ask for opt-in or not, review your specific use cases and speak to your vendor partners. So what do the revenue impacts look like in this new world? Well, a number of studies have been done, and the ones that are particularly troubling are the ones from Facebook and Google, where they've done testing on what it looks like for publishers without personalization in place. A drop of roughly 50% revenue was seen on both sides, comparing a world with a cookie and a world without a cookie. And of course, this means that advertising efficacy is similarly going to drop if publishers are unable to target or identify a particular user. If we go in deep into what the capability impacts are, we can look at what the world looks like now, for instance, in a retargeting use case. And we touched on this briefly last time. But the way it works is if a cookie can be dropped, an advertiser can associate behavior with an individual user. And that same cookie can be recognized on a publisher website, allowing the publisher to retarget. In the future state, in the absence of the cookie or in the absence of the ID for advertisers, that same flow can't happen. So it's no longer going to be possible for impacted platforms, which are both third-party cookies and app tracking transparency. It's not going to be possible across web or mobile web. It won't be possible on iOS unless there's that two-way opt-in that I mentioned before. It's still going to be possible on Android and via customer match-based mechanisms. And I will circle back to this, but it's just a watch out to say that Apple's enforcement and their app tracking transparency also mentions specifically capturing emails and using it for matching purposes as something where you will need to ask for opt-in. So another thing to closely consider and speak through with your team and your vendors. If we look at the world of suppression, it's a very similar use case where at the moment an advertiser can drop a cookie, associate the behavior that, for instance, they're a high value customer that is spending a lot. We don't necessarily need to show them more ads. And that cookie can be recognized on the publisher site and suppress the user. We don't want to target that user. We don't want to show them an ad. And in the future state, again, without that cookie or that device identifier, we can't associate that behavior. We can't suppress that ad from being shown. It's impacted by both third-party cookies and app tracking transparency. Again, not possible on mobile, on web or mobile web or iOS without that two-way opt-in. And again, still possible on Android or by customer match mechanisms. Frequency capping. It's a case right now where a lot of this occurs just on the publisher side, but maybe over a period of time, days, weeks, etc., or across multiple publishers, ensuring that the user isn't exposed to the same ads wherever they go around the internet. So right now, the cookie can be recognized. We can say, for instance, we've already shown this ad to this user 9 times. 10 is the absolute limit, and after that, we're going to shut off showing this particular ad. But without the cookie or device identifier in place, we can no longer keep that count. We can no longer suppress based on that cap. Again, same things, impacted by both third-party cookies and app tracking transparency. No longer possible on web, mobile web, or iOS without that two-way opt-in. Still possible on Android. And it is still possible via other means, but what we would consider weaker identifiers. So for instance, an IP address, which designates an internet connection to try and use that as a proxy for a particular device, or a session identifier. So we may not be able to stop the user seeing ads over the course of a week, but at least we can ensure on a single, watching TV session or watching catch-up TV session that they're not seeing the same ad 10 times. On to measurement. So a very similar thing again. The cookie's dropped when the publisher displays the ad. The cookie's recognized when something happens on the advertiser site, like someone completes a purchase. And we want to report back on the success that that campaign led to the purchase, the campaign was successful. In the absence of a cookie, the publisher is still able to display the ad, but that advertiser conversion can't be linked back and we can't accurately report on it. Again, something that is impacted by both sets of identifiers, third-party cookies and app tracking transparency. Not possible on web, mobile web, or iOS without two-way opt-in. Still possible on Android. And there are alternative mechanisms with a different efficacy, it must be said, but still ways to retain some of this visibility. So for instance, last click attribution, you might not get the full journey of how the user got to the site and converted, but knowing the last step that they took, that the last campaign, if they did click on the ad, got them there and then they converted, that is still possible from a web context. And Apple's SK ad network or SCAD network framework that we mentioned before, where you're going to get this aggregate view. It's not going to give you individual granularity, but you will have aggregate view of the number of conversions or, for instance, installs that a campaign drove. Lookalike audiences and a classic use case that is associated with data management platforms, right? If we identify a high-value customer, let's build an audience of those high-value customers. Let's expand that modeled pool to similar users that behave almost exactly the same, but perhaps haven't converted. And then target that expanded pool to try and bring in what we think are more qualified audiences. But every step in that chain breaks, again, in the absence of a third-party cookie or a relevant device identifier. We can't build that initial pool of high-value customers without the cookie. We can't expand that pool because we don't have a broader pool to look at, and we can't then target them without those identifiers in place. Exactly the same. Impacted by both means, not possible by all the usual means unless there's a two-way opt-in on iOS. Still possible on Android and via the customer match-based mechanisms with the same caveat as before. You need to look at Apple's enforcement when you're considering ID-based capability. View through attribution. So this particular use case is, imagine we want to capture or measure users when they've seen the ad but not clicked on the ad, right? They come back the next day or they browse to the site via a different means. And the way that this is done is when the ad is dropped, that the publisher drops the cookie is recognized when they convert